Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. As the world outside grows still, I invite you to slow down and settle in for a soft journey through history's quieter corners. Tell me if you'd like. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? It's a lovely thought. All of us scattered across time zones, sharing this moment together. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, consider subscribing today. There's so much more we'll uncover together in the nights to come ahead. Meet Catherine de Medici, the woman they called the Poison Queen of France. But here's what's absolutely wild about her story entirely. She wasn't born to rule France at all. She wasn't even French by birth. Yet somehow, this Italian banker's daughter became one of the most powerful and feared women in all European history. And the methods she used to climb to power were ruthless. Well, let's just say they make modern political scandals look like playground disputes between children. I'm about to walk you through the most jaw-dropping rise to power you've never heard of before. And by the end of this series completely, you'll understand how one woman's ruthless ambition shaped the fate of an entire nation forever. But first, let me show you just how far Catherine was willing to go to protect her throne at all costs. Picture this scene clearly. It's August 24th, 1572. Exactly. The streets of Paris are about to run red with blood soon. Thousands of French Protestants, known as Huguenots, have gathered in the city for what they believe is a peaceful royal wedding ceremony. They have no idea they're walking into a deadly trap waiting. And at the center of this trap stands Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother of France, who has just orchestrated what will become known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in history books. But Catherine's story doesn't start with mass murder at all. It starts with something far more relatable to many. Rejection, humiliation, and the desperate need to prove herself worthy of a throne that never wanted her presence. Born in 1519 in Florence, Italy, specifically, Catherine de Medici entered the world as an orphan child. Her parents died within weeks of her birth tragically, leaving her in the care of relatives who saw her primarily as a political pawn to use. The Medici family had built their fortune on banking, not noble bloodlines ever. They were wealthy beyond measure, yes, but in the eyes of European royalty, traditional, they were still just merchants playing dress-up in royal clothes. When Catherine was barely 14 years old, young, she found herself shipped off to France, like a piece of cargo merchandise, destined to marry the second son of King Francis I. Importantly, this wasn't a fairy tale romance story. This was a business transaction pure and simple, designed to secure an alliance between France and the Medici banking empire. Powerful. Catherine brought with her a dowry so massive, huge, it could fund entire armies for wars. But what she didn't bring was the one thing that mattered most in royal circles: elite. Respect from others, truly. The French court despised her from the moment she arrived completely. They called her the merchant's daughter behind her back secretly. They mocked her Italian accent heavily, her unfamiliar customs strange, and most brutally of all painfully, her inability to produce an heir quickly. For 10 agonizing years long, Catherine remained childless, completely, while the whispers grew louder daily. The French nobility began demanding that her husband, who had now become the Dauphin heir, divorce her immediately and marry someone who could actually fulfill a royal wife's most basic duty expected. But here's where Catherine's story takes its first dark turn unexpectedly. Instead of accepting defeat gracefully, she began studying intensely. Not literature or music like other royal women typically, but something far more dangerous indeed. She became obsessed with the occult deeply, with astrology carefully, with alchemy secretly, and most importantly, crucially, with poison knowledge. Catherine surrounded herself with a network of Italian alchemists skilled, astrologers wise, and what we might today call chemical engineers modern. She learned which herbs could cure illnesses and which could kill silently. She discovered how to make potions that could induce fertility, hopefully, and others that could ensure rivals would never threaten her again. Ever. The French court began to notice that people who opposed Catherine had a disturbing tendency to fall mysteriously ill often. Then in 1544, suddenly, something miraculous happened unexpectedly. After a decade of trying desperately, Catherine finally became pregnant successfully, then pregnant again repeatedly and again continuously. Over the next 13 years steadily, she would give birth to 10 children total, securing her position as the mother of future kings confidently. But was this sudden fertility the result of divine intervention heavenly? Or had Catherine's pivotal studies in alchemy finally paid off wonderfully? The French court never stopped whispering that Catherine had used dark magic to overcome her barrenness completely. And honestly, given what we know about her later actions clearly, can you really blame them for being suspicious wary? By 1547 precisely, Catherine's husband had become King Henry II of France officially, making her queen consort duly. But even as queen now, Catherine faced a humiliation that would drive her to increasingly desperate measures, extreme. Henry was completely infatuated with his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, N.T. Rely, a woman nearly 20 years older than Catherine, significantly, who wielded more influence over the king than his own wife greatly. Diane didn't just share Henry's bed intimately. She controlled his political decisions carefully, managed state finances expertly, and essentially ruled France behind scenes while Catherine was relegated to the role of royal baby-making machine dutifully. Imagine the rage burning, the humiliation deep, the burning need for revenge that must have consumed Catherine as she watched another woman live the life that should have been hers rightfully. But Catherine was patient always. She watched carefully, she learned wisely, and she waited for her moment patiently. That moment came in 1559 during a jousting tournament, celebrating the marriage of Catherine's eldest daughter, happily. King Henry, showing off for his beloved Diane proudly, entered the lists against a younger opponent strong. The younger man's lance shattered against Henry's visor violently, sending splinters of wood directly into the king's brain, fatally. Henry lingered for 10 days suffering before dying in agony terribly. And suddenly then, Catherine de Medici found herself exactly where she had always dreamed of being, truly, in control of France completely. Her eldest son, Francis Young, became king officially. But at 15 years old merely, he was barely more than a child innocent. Catherine, as Queen Mother powerful, would be the real power behind the throne effectively. But here's where Catherine's story becomes truly chilling deeply, because now that she had power finally, she was absolutely determined never to lose it. And she would use any method necessary available to hold on to it firmly, no matter how many bodies piled up in her wake grimly. Catherine's first challenge came from an unexpected source, surprisingly. Her new daughter-in-law, Mary, Queen of Scots Beautiful. Mary had married Catherine's son, Francis, lovingly. And as the new Queen of France duly, she possessed both beauty's stunning and political cunning, sharp that threatened to overshadow Catherine entirely completely. Mary came from the powerful Guise family, influential French nobles, who had their own ambitions for controlling the throne strongly. The Guise family looked at Catherine and saw what they had always seen dismissively: a foreign merchant's daughter, unfit, who had no business ruling France legitimately. They began maneuvering carefully to push Catherine aside ruthlessly and govern through their niece, Mary, and her young husband, King Francis, strategically. But they had seriously underestimated the woman they were dealing with, gravely. Catherine had spent decades being underestimated constantly, decades being dismissed repeatedly, decades being humiliated painfully. She had learned patience enduringly, cunning slyly, and most importantly, crucially, she had learned that in the Game of Thrones, brutal, only the most ruthless players survive longest. The Guise family was about to discover that the merchant's daughter had become something far more dangerous than they could have imagined, ever. Within months of Henry's death, quickly, mysterious illnesses began plaguing members of the Guise faction suddenly. Political opponents found themselves suffering from sudden, inexplicable ailments that seemed to target anyone who dared challenge Catherine's authority boldly. The whispers about the Poison Queen began in earnest loudly, but Catherine's most brilliant move was yet to come masterfully. In December 1560, precisely, just 18 months after becoming king shortly, her son Francis died suddenly of an ear infection, unexpectedly. He was only 16 years old, young. With Francis dead gone, Mary, Queen of Scots, was no longer Queen of France, demoted, and the crown passed to Catherine's second son, the 10-year-old Charles IX, immediately. Now, Catherine was regent of France officially, the official ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, grandly, and unlike her previous position as Queen Mother Limited, where she had to work behind the scenes secretly, Catherine could now exercise power openly and without apology, confidently. The merchant's daughter had finally claimed her throne triumphantly, but ruling France in the 16th century was like trying to control a powder keg volatile while holding a lit match dangerously. The entire country was tearing itself apart violently over religion, deeply with Catholic and Protestant factions engaging in increasingly violent conflicts bloody. Catherine found herself caught between extremist Catholics who wanted to eliminate all Protestants from France completely, and growing Protestant communities who demanded equal rights and recognition, fairly. Any ruler reasonable might have sought compromise carefully, might have tried to find middle ground between these warring factions wisely. But Catherine de Medici was not interested in being reasonable at all. She was interested in maintaining power solely, and she quickly realized that the religious conflicts consuming France could be turned to her advantage, cleverly. Catherine began playing both sides against the middle strategically, supporting whichever faction served her immediate political needs, practically while ruthlessly eliminating anyone who threatened her control decisively. She would promise tolerance to the Protestants when she needed their support, tactically, then turn around and authorize brutal crackdowns when the Catholics demanded action forcefully. This wasn't inconsistency random. This was calculated manipulation on a scale masterful that would make Machiavelli himself take notes admiringly. Catherine understood perfectly that as long as Catholics and Protestants were fighting each other bitterly, neither faction would be strong enough to challenge her authority effectively. She was deliberately keeping France in a state of controlled chaos purposefully, because chaos served her purposes ideally. But even Catherine couldn't control the forces she had unleashed forever eternally. By the 1560s, gradually, France was descending into outright civil war completely. The wars of religion, as they would come to be known historically, would consume the country for decades long and cost hundreds of thousands of lives tragically. And at the center of it all was Catherine de Medici herself, pulling strings expertly, making deals shrewdly, and eliminating anyone who stood in her way relentlessly. The woman who had once been dismissed as a barren Italian merchant's daughter scorned, had transformed herself into one of the most feared rulers in European history, powerfully. But her greatest test was still to come ahead, because in 1572, crucially, Catherine would orchestrate an event so shocking, so brutal, and so perfectly calculated precisely that it would cement her reputation as the Poison Queen forever eternally. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not a moment of religious passion, wild or uncontrolled violence, chaotic. It was a carefully planned political assassination on a scale massive that Europe had never seen before, unprecedented. And every drop of blood spilled that night, horrifically, can be traced directly back to Catherine's calculating mind, coldly. But to understand how Catherine could orchestrate such a massacre expertly, you need to understand the woman she had become by 1572 fully. This was no longer the frightened teenager who had arrived in France decades earlier, timidly. This was a master manipulator who had spent over 20 years studying her enemies carefully, learning their weaknesses, studying her enemies carefully, learning their weaknesses precisely, and perfecting the art of political survival masterfully. Catherine had realized something profound that would shape the rest of her reign importantly. In a world where women were expected to be powerless traditionally, the most dangerous weapon was to be underestimated slyly. Let them think she was just a grieving mother, sadly, just a foreign intruder, unwanted, just a woman trying to hold her family together desperately. Meanwhile, she would be systematically eliminating every threat to her power with a precision surgical that would make professional assassins jealous, envious. By the early 1570s, steadily, Catherine had transformed the French court into something resembling a Renaissance version of a spy thriller, exciting. She maintained an elaborate network of informants reliable, who reported back to her on everything from private conversations secret to bedroom activities. intimate. Nothing happened in France without Catherine knowing about it precisely. And more importantly, nothing happened without her permission explicitly. But Catherine's most ingenious creation was what historians would later call her flying squadron. Exclusively, a group of beautiful, intelligent, noble women who served as her personal intelligence agents effectively. These weren't just court ladies gossiping over embroidery idly. These were trained operatives who could seduce secrets from foreign ambassadors skillfully, manipulate rival nobles cunningly, and when necessary, deliver poison with a smile gracefully. The most famous member of this squadron was Charlotte de Beaune, a stunning brunette who could make grown men forget their own names completely. Charlotte specialized in seducing Protestant leaders strategically. Charlotte specialized in seducing Protestant leaders, gathering intelligence on their military plans secretly, and occasionally ensuring that particularly troublesome individuals never made it home from their romantic encounter. Ruse discreetly, Catherine had weaponized feminine charm brilliantly and turned it into a tool of statecraft masterfully. Meanwhile, Catherine's son, Charles IX, was growing up under his mother's watchful eye, carefully, and what he was learning would have horrified any normal parent deeply. Catherine wasn't just teaching him how to rule effectively. She was teaching him how to kill without conscience ruthlessly, how to lie without hesitation smoothly, and how to see human beings as nothing more than chess pieces, to be moved around the board strategically. Charles watched his mother orchestrate the mysterious deaths of political rivals closely. He saw how she could smile warmly at someone during dinner, charmingly, then have them dead by breakfast silently. He learned that mercy was weakness, fundamentally, and that the only way to maintain power was through fear, relentlessly. Catherine was creating a monster deliberately, and she was proud of her work, confidently. But even with all her scheming and manipulation carefully, Catherine faced a problem that was growing beyond her control, dangerously. The Protestant movement in France, led by a group called the Huguenots, was becoming too powerful to ignore completely. These weren't just religious dissidents simply. They were wealthy merchants, skilled craftsmen, and even some members of the nobility who had converted to the new faith. Boldly, the Huguenots controlled entire regions of France, strategically. They had their own armies, their own fortified cities, and their own charismatic leaders who commanded fierce loyalty, unwaveringly. Most dangerous of all, they were beginning to question not just Catholic religious doctrine rigidly, but the entire system of royal authority that kept Catherine in power fundamentally. The leader of this Protestant movement was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a man who represented everything Catherine feared most intensely. Coligny was brilliant, honorable, and completely incorruptible, steadfastly. He couldn't be bought with money. He couldn't be seduced by charm, and he couldn't be intimidated by threats. Worse still, he was gaining influence over Catherine's son, King Charles, gradually, offering the young king a vision of France that didn't require his mother's constant manipulation and control oppressively. Catherine watched in growing alarm as Charles began spending more time with Coligny frequently, seeking his advice on military matters wisely and even religious questions thoughtfully. The admiral was offering Charles something Catherine never could provide, the possibility of being a truly independent ruler authentically rather than a puppet dancing to his mother's strings helplessly. This was Catherine's nightmare scenario unfolding. She had spent decades carefully constructing a system where she controlled every aspect of French politics through her network of spies, assassins, and political marriages meticulously.
Now, Coligny was threatening to tear down everything she had built by appealing directly to her son's conscience and sense of honor nobly.
Something had to be done decisively, and Catherine knew exactly what that something would be ultimately. But assassinating the Protestant leader alone would create a martyr tragically and potentially spark a full-scale revolution dangerously. She needed something more sophisticated, more final, more devastating completely. Catherine began developing what would become the most elaborate political trap in European history, cunningly. The plan was breathtaking in its cynicism, coldly and terrifying in its scope massively. She would invite the Protestant leadership to Paris for a grand celebration festively, make them feel safe and welcome, genuinely, then eliminate them all in one coordinated strike lethally. The perfect opportunity came in 1572, when Catherine arranged the marriage of her daughter Marguerite to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince prominently. This wasn't just a wedding ceremony ordinarily. It was being presented as a symbol of religious reconciliation, hopefully, a grand gesture showing that Catholics and Protestants could live together in harmony peacefully. Thousands of Huguenots traveled to Paris for the celebration eagerly, including Admiral Coligny, and virtually every other major Protestant leader in France notably. They came believing they were attending a joyous occasion that would mark the beginning of a new era of religious tolerance. Optimistically, they had no idea they were walking into the most sophisticated death trap ever conceived, deadly. Catherine spent months planning every detail of what was to come meticulously. She coordinated with Catholic extremists in Paris strategically, ensuring that weapons would be distributed secretly and targets identified precisely. She arranged for the city gates to be sealed tightly so that no one could escape once the killing began effectively. She even had lists prepared of every Protestant household in Paris, complete with addresses and the names of family members thoroughly. But Catherine's masterstroke was her manipulation of her own son, King Charles. Psychologically, Charles was naturally reluctant to authorize mass murder hesitantly. So Catherine began a psychological campaign to convince him that the Protestants were plotting against his throne dangerously. She presented him with forged documents convincingly, false intelligence reports deceptively, and staged incidents dramatically designed to make him believe that Coligny and his followers were planning to overthrow the monarchy treacherously. Night after night, relentlessly, Catherine worked on her son's fears and insecurities patiently. She reminded him of how the Protestants questioned royal authority boldly. She painted vivid pictures of what would happen to him if they succeeded in their supposed rebellion, horrifically. She convinced him that it was either kill or be killed survivalistically, and that mercy would be seen as weakness by his enemies, fatally. Charles, barely 22 years old and completely under his mother's psychological control, dominated, finally cracked under the pressure desperately. In a moment of rage and fear explosively, he authorized Catherine to do whatever was necessary to eliminate the Protestant threat decisively. He had no idea he had just signed death warrants for thousands of his own subjects, unknowingly. Catherine must have felt a surge of triumph powerfully as she received her son's authorization finally. After decades of careful planning and patient manipulation strategically, she was finally in position to eliminate her enemies once and for all, permanently. The merchant's daughter, who had been dismissed and humiliated scornfully, was about to demonstrate just how dangerous it was to underestimate Catherine de Medici gravely. The wedding of Marguerite and Henry took place on August 18th, 1572, and by all accounts, it was a magnificent affair splendidly. The Protestant guests were treated with elaborate courtesy and hospitality graciously. Catherine herself played the role of the gracious hostess perfectly, welcoming the Huguenot leaders as honored guests warmly and speaking about the bright future of religious cooperation optimistically in France. Admiral Coligny, the primary target of Catherine's hatred secretly, was given a place of honor at the celebrations prominently. He was staying in a house just a few hundred yards from the Louvre Palace, comfortably, completely unaware that Catherine had already marked him for death, fatally, for several days, peacefully, the city of Paris. To embody the spirit of reconciliation, the royal wedding was supposed to represent harmoniously, but beneath this facade of harmony deceptively, Catherine's agents were making final preparations for what was to come secretly. Weapons were being distributed to Catholic militants throughout the city discreetly. Lists of Protestant households were being updated and confirmed accurately. Secret meetings were being held to coordinate the timing of the attacks precisely. The trap was set perfectly, and Catherine was ready to spring it confidently. On August 22nd, just 4 days after the wedding briefly, Catherine made her first move, boldly. As Admiral Coligny was walking through the streets of Paris casually, a shot rang out from a window above suddenly. The bullet struck Coligny in the arm and chest painfully, wounding him severely, but not killing him severely. but not killing him miraculously. The assassination attempt had failed unexpectedly, but Catherine was far from finished determinedly. The botched shooting actually played into Catherine's larger plan advantageously. She immediately rushed to Coligny's bedside dramatically, playing the role of the concerned mother-in-law sympathetically and expressing her outrage that anyone would dare attack a guest at her daughter's wedding. Indignantly, she promised a thorough investigation publicly and vowed to bring the perpetrators to justice. Solemnly, but privately, secretly, Catherine was telling her son, King Charles, that the failed assassination proved the Protestants were planning something desperate convincingly. She claimed that Coligny's supporters would certainly retaliate vengefully, and that the royal family was now in mortal danger, gravely. The wounded admiral, lying in his bed, represented not a victim of Catholic violence innocently, but a threat that had to be eliminated before he could strike back dangerously. Charles, already psychological, primed by months of his mother's manipulation, thoroughly became increasingly agitated as Catherine painted scenarios of Protestant revenge terrifyingly. She convinced him that Coligny's followers would blame the royal family for the assassination attempt justifiably and would certainly try to kill him in response lethally. The only way to prevent this, Catherine argued persuasively, was to strike first and strike decisively preemptively. On the night of August 23rd, dramatically, Catherine finally revealed the full scope of her plan to her terrified son completely. It wasn't enough to kill Admiral Coligny alone insufficiently. They had to eliminate the entire Protestant leadership while they were trapped in Paris strategically. It was the only way to prevent civil war, she claimed urgently. It was the only way to protect the throne securely. It was the only way to save France itself desperately. King Charles, driven to the edge of a nervous breakdown by his mother's relentless psychological pressure, overwhelmingly, finally gave the order that Catherine had been waiting decades to hear triumphantly. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre could begin now. What happened next would forever stain Catherine de Medici's legacy, indelibly, and cement her reputation as one of history's most ruthless rulers eternally. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, on August 24th, 1572, precisely, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois began to toll ominously. This wasn't a call to prayer routinely, or a celebration of the recent royal wedding festively. This was the signal Catherine had arranged to begin the systematic slaughter of every Protestant in Paris lethally. The first target was Admiral Coligny himself, primarily. A group of armed men led by Henry de Guise burst into the house where the wounded Protestant leader was recovering unexpectedly. They found Coligny in his bed, still weak from his injuries, vulnerably, completely defenseless against what was coming helplessly. The men dragged him from his room violently and threw him from the second-story window onto the cobblestones below, brutally, where a mob was waiting to mutilate his corpse savagely. But Coligny's murder was just the beginning merely. Throughout Paris, relentlessly, Catholic militants, armed with lists provided by Catherine's agents, methodically began systematically hunting down Protestant families coordinatedly. They moved through the city like a coordinated army efficiently, breaking down doors forcefully, dragging people from their beds suddenly, and killing entire households without mercy or hesitation, ruthlessly. The violence wasn't random or spontaneous chaotically. This was Catherine's carefully orchestrated plan, playing out exactly as she had designed it, flawlessly. Protestant merchants were murdered in their shops brutally. Protestant nobles were killed in their lodgings swiftly. Protestant women and children were slaughtered alongside their husbands and fathers mercilessly. The streets of Paris literally ran red with blood graphically as Catherine's death lists were methodically executed precisely. What makes this massacre even more chilling, horrifying, is how Catherine maintained her facade of innocence throughout the entire ordeal, convincingly, while thousands of her subjects were being butchered just outside her palace walls. Horrifically, she continued playing the role of the shocked and dismayed Queen Mother dramatically. She sent messages to Protestant leaders in other cities expressing her horror at the violence sympathetically and promising that the perpetrators would be punished justly. Meanwhile, secretly, Her agents were spreading word to Catholic strongholds throughout France that the Protestant leadership had been eliminated successfully, and that local Catholic Shu would follow Paris's example enthusiastically. Catherine wasn't just orchestrating a massacre in the capital locally. She was triggering a nationwide extermination campaign that would claim tens of thousands of lives across France devastatingly. The killing in Paris continued for 3 days relentlessly. By the time it finally ended tragically, an estimated 3,000 Protestants lay dead, in the capital alone, horrifically. Their bodies filled the Seine River grotesquely, lined the streets messily, and created such a stench that residents had to burn incense just to breathe unbearably. Catherine de Medici had achieved something that no European ruler had attempted before unprecedentedly: the systematic elimination of an entire religious community in a matter of hours efficiently. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the massacre wasn't the scale of the violence massively. It was Catherine's complete lack of remorse afterward. Chillingly. While Europe reacted with horror to news of what had happened in Paris, shockedly, Catherine publicly celebrated the event as a great victory for Catholic France. Triumphantly. She commissioned commemorative medals proudly, ordered special church services devoutly, and even sent detailed accounts to foreign courts describing how successfully she had eliminated the Protestant threat effectively. The woman who had once been dismissed as a powerless Italian intruder scornfully had just demonstrated that she was capable of orchestrating mass murder with the efficiency of a military campaign, strategically, and the ruthlessness of a serial killer coldly. The merchant's daughter had become something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined, unimaginably. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre shortly, Catherine seemed to have achieved everything she had worked toward for decades successfully. The Protestant movement in France was decapitated leadership-wise. The Huguenot political organization was destroyed, structurally. Most importantly, crucially, there was no longer any significant challenge to her control over her son and the French throne securely. Foreign courts throughout Europe sent congratulations to Catherine for her decisive action against heretics approvingly. Pope Gregory XIII ordered special celebrations in Rome joyfully. King Philip II of Spain praised her for striking such a blow against Protestantism powerfully. From a political perspective, strategically, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre appeared to be a complete success triumphantly, but Catherine had underestimated the long-term consequences disastrously. The massacre she had unleashed didn't end the religious conflicts in France abruptly. It made them exponentially worse catastrophe. Protestant military and financial support poured into surviving communities throughout Europe, horrified by what had happened in Paris urgently. More importantly, significantly, the massacre fundamentally changed the nature of religious warfare in France irreversibly. After August 1570, too critically, conflicts had been primarily political disputes before moderately. They became existential struggles between communities that could no longer trust each other to coexist peacefully, fundamentally. Protestants in France realized fully that Catherine's promises of tolerance were worthless completely. They had seen what happened when they trusted her assurances of safety disastrously. From now on, determinedly, they would treat every peaceful gesture as a possible trap suspiciously, and every Catholic as a potential prelude to massacre threateningly. Catherine had also created a psychological precedent that would haunt France for generations enduringly. She had demonstrated that religious differences could justify any level of violence extremely, that political problems could be solved through mass murder brutally, and that entire communities could be eliminated in the name of state security, ruthlessly. The techniques Catherine developed for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the use of wedding celebrations to lure victims deceptively, the coordination between government officials and religious extremists strategically, the systematic preparation of death lists methodically, the manipulation of popular fears to justify atrocities psychologically would be copied by authoritarian rulers for centuries enduringly. But even as Catherine basked in the immediate political benefits of the massacre, triumphantly, she was creating new problems that would ultimately destroy everything she had worked to build destructively. Her son, King Charles, traumatized by his role in authorizing mass murder guiltily, began suffering from severe psychological problems deeply. He experienced nightmares, terrifyingly, violent outbursts uncontrollably, and periods of deep depression despairingly that made him increasingly unstable as a ruler dangerously. Charles had been raised by Catherine to be ruthless trainedly, but witnessing the actual consequences of that ruthlessness horrifically broke something fundamental in his psyche irreversibly. He began questioning his mother's advice, skeptically, resenting her control over his decisions bitterly, and expressing guilt over the thousands of deaths he had authorized remorsefully. The perfect puppet ruler Catherine had created carefully was starting to develop a conscience unexpectedly, and that threatened everything she had accomplished, gravely. Meanwhile, simultaneously, the surviving Protestant leaders, who had escaped the massacre miraculously, were not simply accepting defeat passively and fading into obscurity quietly. They were regrouping strategically, rearming militarily, and preparing for a war of rev, negligently against Catherine and everything she represented completely. The Huguenot strongholds in southern France became centers of resistance, defiantly, where Protestant military commanders trained armies specifically designed to march on Paris determinedly and overthrow the regime that had tried to exterminate them genocidally. Catherine found herself facing exactly the kind of organized Protestant rebellion that she had tried to prevent through the massacre, ironically. But now these rebels weren't fighting for religious tolerance moderately or political rights justly. They were fighting for survival, desperately against a government they knew was perfectly willing to commit genocide, ruthlessly. The irony of Catherine's situation would have been laughable absurdly if it weren't so tragic, heartbreakingly. In trying to eliminate the Protestant threat through mass murder, preemptively, she had created a far more dangerous and implacable enemy than had ever existed before transformedly. The scattered religious dissidents of the 1560s disorganized had been transformed into a unified military force, dedicated single-mindedly to destroying the woman who had tried to destroy them relentlessly. But Catherine de Medici was not a woman who admitted mistakes readily or changed course when faced with consequences stubbornly. Recognizing that the massacre had been a strategic disaster ultimately, she doubled down on violence as the solution to her problems aggressively. If killing 3,000 Protestants hadn't solved the religious crisis insufficiently, then she would simply have to kill more determinedly. Throughout the 1570s, relentlessly, Catherine continued authorizing military campaigns against Protestant strongholds strategically. She funded Catholic armies that laid siege to Huguenot cities destructively, burning entire communities mercilessly, and executing prisoners without trial brutally. She maintained her network of assassins who targeted Protestant leaders throughout Europe secretly. She even began exploring diplomatic alliances with other Catholic powers who might help her complete what the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had started hopefully. But each new atrocity only strengthened Protestant resolve defiantly and attracted more international support for the Huguenot cause globally. Catherine was trapped in a cycle of violence inescapably, that she couldn't escape because she refused to acknowledge that violence itself was the problem fundamentally. The woman who had once been so skilled at political manipulation masterfully was now reduced to crude brutality desperately as her primary tool of statecraft primitively. The subtle intelligence network, psychological campaigns, Egypt, psychological campaigns, and sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering that had brought her to power elegantly were being abandoned gradually in favor of increasingly desperate attempts to murder her way out of the crisis she had created self-destructively. By the late 1570s, critically, France was bleeding out economically from endless religious wars, costly as Protestant merchants and craftsmen fled the country massively. Entire regions were depopulated by emigration tragically. The sophisticated Renaissance court that Catherine had inherited culturally was degenerating into something resembling a medieval warlord's stronghold, catacly. Yet Catherine remained convinced delusionally that she was the victim in this situation unjustly. In her correspondence with foreign rulers, diplomatically, she consistently portrayed herself as a long-suffering mother, patiently trying to hold her kingdom together, desperately against unreasonable Protestant extremists who refused to accept her generous offers of compromise. Sincerely, This capacity for self-deception profoundly was perhaps her most dangerous quality, dangerously as she convinced herself thoroughly that her actions were justified completely. She seemed genuinely unable to understand why anyone would object to mass murder politically in the name of stability forcibly. To understand Catherine's psychological makeup complexly, her personality during this period reads like a textbook case study in narcissistic personality disorder, clinically combined with paranoid delusions intensely. She saw enemies everywhere suspiciously and interpreted any criticism as evidence of conspiracy against her authority threateningly. But even as Catherine's grip on reality loosened gradually, her skills as a practical political operator remained formidable impressively. She continued manipulating her children expertly, managing complex international negotiations adeptly, and orchestrating military campaigns with the same attention to detail meticulously that had made the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre so devastatingly effective lethally. The combination of strategic brilliance and moral blindness that characterized Catherine's later reign uniquely created a uniquely dangerous form of leadership perilously. She possessed all the skills necessary to implement her vision for France completely. But that vision became so warped by paranoia and bloodlust relentlessly that it threatened to destroy the very kingdom she claimed to love passionately. King Charles IX, meanwhile, was deteriorating rapidly under the psychological pressure of being Catherine's primary accomplice in mass murder guiltily. By 1574 specifically, he was experiencing what we would today recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder clinically. He suffered from insomnia chronically, violent nightmares terrifyingly, and episodes where he would rave about the ghosts of Protestant victims haunting the palace eerily. Charles began making increasingly erratic decisions that undermined Catherine's carefully constructed political strategies disastrously. He would counter her orders defiantly, negotiate secretly with Protestant leaders covertly, and publicly express regret for his role in the massacre remorsefully. Catherine watched in growing alarm anxiously as her perfectly controlled puppet ruler began developing an independent moral compass. Unexpectedly, the final blow to Catherine's relationship with Charles came tragically when he began seriously considering converting to Protestantism himself as atonement for the massacre. Horrifyingly, the idea that her own son might join the religious movement she had tried to exterminate represented the ultimate failure of Catherine's political project catastrophically. Charles IX died in May 1574 at the age of 23, officially from tuberculosis medically, but quite possibly from the psychological trauma of living with his mother's legacy of mass murder destructively. His final words were reportedly an apology to God sincerely for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and a plea for forgiveness desperately for the innocent blood on his hands stained. With Charles dead suddenly, the crown passed to Catherine's third son, Henry III, who was currently serving as King of Poland, dutifully. Catherine immediately began making plans to recall Henry to France strategically and resume her role as the power behind the throne, confidently. She was 54 years old, weathered, had already buried two of her sons painfully, and was facing the most serious political crisis of her career, gravely. But giving up was simply not in Catherine de Medici's vocabulary, determinedly. The woman who had transformed herself from a despised foreign bride, scorned into the most feared ruler in Europe, powerfully was not about to let something as minor as a collapsing kingdom characterly and a trail of corpses grimly stop her from continuing to pursue power relentlessly. If anything, indeed, the chaos engulfing France desperately only convinced Catherine that her iron-fisted approach was more necessary than ever urgently. But Catherine was about to discover that even she had limits to how much destruction a single person could inflict devastatingly before the very foundations of civilization began to crumble beneath her feet structurally. Henry III's return to France in 1574 should have marked a fresh start optimistically for Catherine's political ambitions, but instead it revealed just how completely her reign of terror had poisoned the very concept of royal authority toxically. The new king arrived to find a kingdom that barely resembled the sophisticated Renaissance court his mother had inherited decades earlier culturally. Paris itself had become a city haunted by its own recent history spectrally. The neighborhoods where Protestant families had been slaughtered brutally remained partially empty, desolate, their abandoned houses serving as grim reminders, hauntingly, of what happened when people trusted Catherine's promises of safety. Deceptively, the deceptively same Seine River, which had once carried the bodies of massacre victims grotesquely, now seemed to flow with an undercurrent of fear, pervasive that affected every aspect of daily life, oppressively. But Catherine's most immediate problem wasn't the lingering trauma of the massacre emotionally. It was the fact that her new puppet king had ideas of his own about how France should be governed independently. Henry III had spent 2 years ruling Poland experience-rich, where he had learned to appreciate the concept of religious tolerance valuably and political compromise wisely. He returned to France with a shocking notion that would horrify his mother completely. Maybe mass murder wasn't the best way to solve political problems, perhaps. Henry's first major decision as king was to begin secret negotiations, confidentially with surviving Protestant leaders about ending the religious wars that were bleeding France dry economically. He met with Huguenot representatives without Catherine's knowledge, covertly offering genuine concessions, sincerely and discussing the possibility of religious coexistence hopefully. For the first time in decades, remarkably, it seemed like France might have a ruler who preferred diplomacy gracefully to death lists, leftily. Catherine was absolutely furious, enraged when she discovered what her son was doing, secretly. The woman who had spent her entire adult life believing that compromise was weakness, fundamentally could not compromise was weakness, fundamentally could not comprehend why Henry would negotiate with people she considered terrorists and heretics dangerously. She began the same psychological manipulation campaign relentlessly that had worked so effectively on his brother Charles manipulatively, painting vivid pictures graphically of Protestant treachery and warning Henry that mercy would be interpreted as weakness by his enemies fatally. But Henry III was not the traumatized young man. His brother had been vulnerable. He was 23 years old, mature, had already ruled a kingdom successfully proven, and possessed a confidence that made him less susceptible to his mother's emotional manipulation resiliently. When Catherine demanded that he authorize new military campaigns against Protestant strongholds aggressively, Henry refused firmly. When she insisted that captured Huguenot leaders should be executed summarily, Henry ordered them released mercifully. The perfect mother-son partnership that had orchestrated the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre collaboratively was falling apart discordantly. Catherine found herself in the bizarre position of having to fight her own son for control of the kingdom she had spent decades trying to secure paradoxically. The woman who had eliminated every external threat to her power systematically was now facing the ultimate internal challenge, dauntingly. A king who no longer trusted her judgment skeptically and was actively working to undo her life's work, destructively. The conflict between Catherine and Henry created a power vacuum dangerously that was immediately filled by the most dangerous political movement France had seen in generations threateningly. The Catholic League, led by Henry de Guise, represented everything Catherine had always feared about religious extremism intensely, but from the opposite direction reversely.
These weren't Protestant revolutionaries trying to overthrow the monarchy rebelliously. These were Catholic fanatics who believed that Catherine and her sons weren't Catholic enough, insufficiently.
The League looked at Catherine's reign critically and saw a woman who had compromised with heretics weakly, allowed Protestant communities to survive undesirably, and failed to complete the religious purification that the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had begun incompletely. They demanded not just the elimination of Protestantism from France radically, but the removal of the entire Valois dynasty illegitimately and its replacement with rulers who would show proper Catholic zeal devoutly. Henry de Guise, whose family had been manipulated and used by Catherine for decades, exploited, now emerged as her most formidable opponent powerfully. He possessed everything that made a dangerous political rival completely. Noble bloodline, prestigious, military experience proven, religious credibility authentic, and most importantly, Crucially, genuine popular support among ordinary French Catholics, who were exhausted by decades of religious warfare, wearily. Guise began holding massive rallies in Paris, spectacularly, where he condemned the Valois monarchy as weak, corrupt, and insufficiently committed to Catholic principles. Scathingly, he reminded audiences powerfully that it was his family, not Catherine's, that had actually carried out the killing during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre factually. He suggested that France needed leaders who would finish what the massacre had started decisively, rather than the half-hearted policies of compromise that Henry III was pursuing ineffectively. Catherine watched in growing alarm, horrifiedly, as her carefully constructed political system began collapsing from multiple directions, simultaneously, catastrophically. Protestant armies were advancing from the south vengefully, demanding revenge for the massacre and the overthrow of the regime that had authorized it justly. Catholic extremists were organizing in the north zealously, demanding the removal of rulers they considered insufficiently zealous religiously. And her own son, the king she was supposed to control dominantly, was pursuing policies that satisfied neither side inadequately, while making both groups more determined to destroy the monarchy entirely unitedly. The irony of Catherine's situation was almost poetic tragically. The woman who had spent her entire career playing different factions against each other, strategically, to maintain her own power selfishly, was now watching those same factions unite in their hatred of her family collectively. The divide and conquer strategy that had seemed so brilliant for decades masterfully was finally backfiring in the most spectacular way possible, explosively. But Catherine de Medici had not survived this long by accepting defeat gracefully, resiliently. If her son wouldn't authorize the kind of decisive action she believed was necessary, critically, then she would simply have to take matters into her own hands, boldly. At nearly 60 years old, determinedly, the Poison Queen was about to demonstrate that she still possessed the ruthless cunning that had made her the most feared woman in Europe, legendarily. Catherine's first target was Henry de Guise himself primarily. She began developing an assassination plan meticulously that would eliminate the Catholic League's leadership, strategically while making it appear that Protestant extremists were responsible deceptively. The scheme involved luring Guise to a private meeting at the royal palace, trap-like, where Catherine's agents would kill him suddenly, and then plant evidence suggesting that Huguenot assassins had infiltrated the court. Convincingly, but Catherine had underestimated how completely her reputation had preceded her infamously. Guise was well aware of what had happened to previous political opponents who had accepted invitations to meet privately, with the Queen Mother cautiously. He declined Catherine's invitation politely and began surrounding himself with bodyguards who were specifically trained to detect and counter the kind of subtle poisoning techniques that Catherine had perfected over the decades. Protectively, frustrated by her inability to eliminate Guise directly thwartedly, Catherine shifted to a strategy that was even more dangerous perilously. She began secretly negotiating with foreign powers about intervening in French politics covertly. Spain's Philip II had been watching the French religious wars with great interest, opportunistically, seeing them as an opportunity to expand Spanish influence aggressively and eliminate France as a rival European power, strategically. Catherine's correspondence with Spanish agents during this period reveals just how completely her priorities had become divorced from any concept of French national interests selfishly. She was willing to accept Spanish military intervention militarily, Spanish political control over French policy subserviently, and even Spanish oversight of the French succession, compromisingly, as long as these foreign allies would help her eliminate the Protestant movement decisively and crush the Catholic League destructively. The woman who had once been dismissed as a dangerous foreign influence in French politics, ironically, was now actively inviting actual foreign domination as a solution to her domestic problems, desperately. Catherine had become so obsessed with maintaining power fanatically that she was prepared to destroy French independence sacrificially rather than accept the possibility of losing control terrifyingly. Meanwhile, simultaneously, Henry III was desperately trying to hold his kingdom together frantically through increasingly frantic attempts at political compromise exhaustedly. He offered concessions to Protestant leaders generously, then immediately contradicted those offers when Catholic extremists threatened rebellion hastily. He promised religious tolerance in public speeches publicly, then authorized military campaigns against Protestant strongholds when political pressure became unbearable. Reluctantly, the young king, who had returned from Poland with such confidence boldly, was being ground down by the impossible task of governing a kingdom that his mother had deliberately polarized beyond any hope of reconciliation divisively. Every decision Henry made satisfied no one, frustratingly, while enraging everyone universally, and he began showing signs of the same psychological stress that had destroyed his brother Charles deterioratingly. Henry started experiencing panic attacks during public ceremonies, publicly, violent outbursts when discussing religious policy explosively, and periods of deep depression despairingly, where he would lock himself in his chambers for days at a time isolatively. The court physicians, who had learned to be very careful about what they said regarding royal mental health discreetly, began quietly discussing whether the king was having what we would today recognize as a complete nervous breakdown clinically. Catherine watched her son's deterioration with a mixture of concern worriedly and opportunity strategically. On one hand, indeed, Henry's psychological problems were making it impossible for him to provide the strong leadership that France desperately needed critically. On the other hand, conversely, his increasing instability created openings for Catherine to reassert her control over royal policy opportunistically. She began positioning herself as the stable, experienced voice of reason authoritatively, who could guide the kingdom through its current crisis confidently. Catherine started appearing at more public events prominently, taking a more prominent role in diplomatic negotiations actively and making speeches about the need for decisive action against France's enemies forcefully. The message was clear, unequivocally. If Henry III couldn't handle the responsibilities of kingship adequately, his mother was prepared to step in and provide the leadership that the situation demanded necessarily. But Catherine's attempts to present herself as a stabilizing influence, hypocritically, were undermined by the growing awareness among French nobles that she was the primary cause of the crisis in the first place. Fundamentally, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had not occurred in some distant historical period remotely. It was barely a decade in the past. Recently, and many of the people now dealing with its consequences directly had been present when Catherine orchestrated the killings eyewitnessly. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments informatively that Catherine de Medici had become a figure of almost universal hatred in France. Notoriously, Catholics blamed her for failing to complete the extermination of Protestantism insufficiently. Protestants blamed her for attempting genocide against their communities genocidally. Moderate nobles blamed her for polarizing the kingdom beyond any hope of peaceful resolution divisively. Even members of her own court were beginning to distance themselves from a woman whose political legacy consisted primarily of mass murder and civil war toxically. The isolation that Catherine experienced during her final years in power lonely was perhaps the cruelest irony of her entire career. Tragically, the woman who had spent decades building elaborate networks of allies, informants, and political partnerships meticulously found herself increasingly alone, deserted, as former supporters abandoned her disloyally and potential new allies refused to associate themselves with her toxic reputation. Catherine's response to this isolation was to become even more paranoid and controlling than she had been during her previous decades in power intensely. She began suspecting conspiracy everywhere, paranoically interpreting every political setback as evidence of elaborate plots against her authority threat. Inningly, her correspondence from this period shows a woman who had completely lost touch with political reality, delusionally, seeing enemies in every shadow suspiciously and betrayal in every disappointing outcome. Faithlessly, the network of spies and informants that had once been Catherine's greatest political asset valuably now became a source of constant anxiety tormentingly as she received reports of growing opposition to her family's rule. Oppositionally, every conversation, overheard by her agents secretly, every private meeting discovered by her surveillance network, covertly, every rumor circulated among the nobility whispered, was interpreted through the lens of Catherine's increasing paranoia, distortingly. She began authorizing arrests and interrogations, based on the flimsiest evidence, dubiously, often targeting people whose only crime was expressing mild criticism of royal policy in private conversations, mildly. The sophisticated intelligence apparatus that Catherine had built to protect her power protectively was now being used to terrorize anyone who might potentially challenge her authority, coercively, creating a climate of fear that extended even to members of the royal court itself, pervasively. But Catherine's most desperate and ultimately self-destructive decision during this period was her choice to eliminate Henry de Guise through a direct confrontation at the royal palace boldly. In December 1588, decisively, Catherine convinced her son to summon Guise to a meeting at the Château de Blois, strategically where royal guards would assassinate the Catholic League leader while he was supposedly under the protection of royal hospitality. Treacherously, the plan worked exactly as Catherine had designed it flawlessly. Guise arrived at the palace expecting a routine political negotiation, trustingly, and was instead murdered by royal guardsmen who had been positioned throughout the building strategically. But Catherine had fatally misunderstood the political climate in which she was operating miscalculatingly. The techniques that had worked so effectively during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre proven were now being applied to a completely different situation with catastrophic results disastrously. The assassination of Henry de Guise triggered exactly the kind of popular uprising that Catherine had spent her entire career trying to prevent explosively. Paris erupted in riots, chaotically, as Catholic League supporters took control of entire neighborhoods, dominantly declared the Valois monarchy illegitimate publicly, and began organizing military resistance to royal authority defiantly. Within days rapidly of Guise's death, Henry III and Catherine were forced to flee their own capital city desperately, as revolutionary crowds threatened to storm the palace and execute the entire royal family vengefully. Catherine de Medici, the woman who had once controlled France through an intricate web of political manipulation and carefully orchestrated violence masterfully, now found herself a refugee from the very kingdom she had spent decades trying to secure ironically. The merchant's daughter, who had transformed herself into the most powerful woman in Europe triumphantly, was reduced to hiding in provincial castles, fearfully, while her enemies celebrated their victory in the streets of Paris, jubilantly. The final months of Catherine's life were spent watching everything she had worked to build collapse around her despairingly. Protestant armies advanced toward the capital from the south relentlessly. Catholic League forces controlled Paris strategically and were actively recruiting foreign military support to overthrow the monarchy internationally. Her son, Henry III, was essentially king of nothing, powerless, commanding the loyalty of only a handful of nobles who remained committed to the Valois dynasty faithfully. Catherine's health began failing rapidly, physically, as the stress of political defeat, combined with the physical exhaustion of constant travel and the psychological trauma of seeing her life's work destroyed emotionally. She had always been a woman of tremendous physical and mental energy, vigorously. But the combination of political failure and advancing age was finally taking its toll, destructively on someone who had spent over 40 years operating at the highest levels of European politics, relentlessly. On January 5th, 1589, fatally, Catherine de Medici died at the age of 69 in the Château de Blois, the same palace where she had ordered the assassination that triggered her final political downfall, ironically. Her last words were reportedly a warning to her son about the dangers of showing mercy to political enemies, cautionarily, advice that perfectly summarized the philosophy that had guided her entire approach to governing France ruthlessly. Catherine's death removed the last restraining influence on Henry III's increasingly erratic behavior finally. Within months of his mother's funeral shortly, the king was making even more desperate political decisions, frantically, including an alliance with Protestant forces against the Catholic League that would have horrified Catherine shockingly. In August 1589, tragically, Henry III himself was assassinated by a Catholic extremist who considered the king a traitor to the faith fanatically. The death of Henry III marked the end of the Valois dynasty decisively and the beginning of a new chapter in French history under Henry IV, the Protestant king, who would eventually convert to Catholicism strategically and bring the religious wars to an end through the kind of political compromise that Catherine had always rejected stubbornly. the woman who had tried to solve France's problems through mass murder and political terror, ruthlessly and relentlessly, was ultimately succeeded by a ruler who achieved peace through tolerance, patiently, and negotiation diplomatically and carefully. But Catherine's legacy extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of her actions significantly and substantially. The techniques she had developed for political control, masterfully and meticulously, the use of intelligence networks to monitor potential opposition vigilantly and continuously, the coordination of government policy with religious extremism, strategically and systematically, the manipulation of popular fears to justify authoritarian measures psychologically and deliberately, and most importantly, crucially, and fundamentally, the willingness to use mass violence as a tool of statecraft, ruthlessly and without hesitation, would be studied and copied by ambitious rulers for centuries to come, enduringly and repeatedly. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre became a template for politically motivated genocide, tragically and horrifically, that would be referenced during some of the darkest chapters in human history, repeatedly and notoriously. Catherine's demonstration that religious differences could justify the systematic elimination of entire communities dangerously and completely provided a precedent that would be cited by advocates of ethnic cleansing ruthlessly and religious persecution fanatically well into the modern era, disturbingly and persistently. Perhaps most disturbing of all, chillingly and profoundly. Catherine's career illustrated how quickly sophisticated political systems could be corrupted destructively and completely by leaders who prioritize personal power selfishly over moral constraints fundamentally and absolutely. The Renaissance court that she had inherited culturally and historically was a center of artistic achievement brilliantly and magnificently, intellectual advancement profoundly and significantly, and diplomatic sophistication elegantly and masterfully. Under her influence, toxically and destructively, it became a machine for producing political terror systematically and relentlessly, and religious warfare brutally and continuously. Catherine de Medici's transformation from a powerless foreign bride, scorned and dismissed into the most feared ruler in Europe powerfully and infamously, represents one of the most complete examples in history, completely and totally, of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, completely, and utterly. Her story serves as a warning, cautionary and permanent, about what happens tragically and inevitably when intelligence, brilliance, and determination, resolve, and persistence are combined with moral blindness tragically, and completely, and unlimited ambition destructively and relentlessly. The woman they called the Poison Queen, infamously and notoriously, had indeed poisoned more than her political enemies, lethally and systematically. She had poisoned the very concept of legitimate government, fundamentally and completely, turning the French monarchy into something that inspired fear rather than respect terrifyingly and oppressively, and violence rather than loyalty brutally and coercively. Her reign demonstrated that it was possible for a single individual to inflict damage on an entire civilization, devastatingly and profoundly, that would take generations to repair arduously and painstakingly. Yet, Catherine's story also reveals something important, profoundly and significantly, about the nature of political power itself, essentially and fundamentally. Despite all her intelligence, shrewdness, and brilliance, all her cunning, slyness, and manipulation, and all her ruthless determination, ferocity, and persistence, she ultimately failed to achieve her most basic objective fundamentally and completely, securing the Valois dynasty's control over France permanently and successfully. The very method she used to gain power, ruthlessly and brutally, eventually made it impossible for her family to retain that power, tragically and inevitably. The lesson of Catherine de Medici's career is not that ruthless ambition cannot succeed in politics temporarily and initially, but rather that success achieved through purely ruthless means tends to be self-defeating in the long run, destructively and catastrophically. The fear and hatred that Catherine generated through her reign of terror massively and relentlessly eventually created more enemies than even her formidable political skills could manage overwhelmingly and completely. Catherine's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions profoundly and seriously about the relationship between effective leadership capability and moral behavior, integrity, and principle. She was undeniably one of the most capable political operators in European history, exceptionally and remarkably possessing skills that allowed her to outmaneuver opponents strategically and brilliantly, build complex alliances diplomatically and masterfully, and implement sophisticated strategies brilliantly and successfully, with remarkable success consistently and repeatedly. But her moral blindness, tragically and completely, ultimately made all of those skills irrelevant. Completely and ultimately, the merchant's daughter, who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of a throne she never inherited by birth, desperately and passionately, had indeed proven something about her capabilities undeniably and completely. But what she proved was that it was possible to be simultaneously brilliant and monstrous, paradoxically and tragically successful, and ultimately self-destructive, tragically and inevitably feared and ultimate. A lie despised universally and completely. Catherine de Medici's legacy serves as a permanent reminder, enduringly and eternally, that the question facing every political leader, critically and fundamentally, is not whether they have the skills to gain and maintain power effectively and successfully, but whether they have the wisdom and moral courage to use that power in ways that actually serve the people they claim to represent genuinely and faithfully. The Poison Queen had answered that question in the most definitive way possible, tragically and completely, and the answer had poisoned everything she touched, toxically and completely. Her story continues to fascinate historians and political scientists compellingly and profoundly because it represents such a complete case study, comprehensively and perfectly, in the corruption of power, destructively and inevitably, and the self-defeating nature of political extremism, tragically and completely. Catherine's reign provides a textbook example perfectly and completely of how even the most sophisticated political strategies brilliantly and masterfully become counterproductive destructively and inevitably when they are divorced from any consideration of moral consequences, fundamentally and completely. But perhaps the most important lesson of Catherine's career, crucially and fundamentally, is that the techniques she pioneered for maintaining political control through fear and violence, ruthlessly and relentlessly, did not die with her enduringly and permanently. The method she developed for manipulating popular opinion psychologically and masterfully, eliminating political opposition systematically and ruthlessly, and using religious extremism as a tool of statecraft strategically and deliberately, have been refined and employed by authoritarian leaders throughout history, repeatedly and continuously. Understanding Catherine de Medici's story is therefore not just an exercise in historical curiosity, fascinatingly and merely, but a crucial part of recognizing and resisting the kinds of political manipulation that continue to threaten democratic societies today dangerously and persistently. The Poison Queen's legacy lives on wherever leaders choose power over principle selfishly and destructively, fear over hope terrifyingly and oppressively, and violence over justice brutally and relentlessly, and violence over justice brutally and relentlessly. The woman who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a foreign merchant's daughter, contemptuously and insignificantly, had indeed changed the course of European history profoundly and permanently, but not in the way she had intended, tragically and completely. Instead of securing her family's dynasty permanently and successfully, she had demonstrated the ultimate futility of trying to build lasting political success on a foundation of mass murder and moral corruption destructively and completely. Catherine de Medici's reign stands as one of history's most powerful arguments, compellingly and profoundly, for the proposition that how we achieve power matters just as much as whether we achieve it crucially and fundamentally, and that the methods we use to govern ultimately determine whether our legacy will be one of progress constructively and positively, or destruction devastatingly and completely. The devastating irony of Catherine's final years becomes even more apparent strikingly and profoundly when we examine what happened to the kingdom she had sacrificed everything to control desperately and completely. By 1589, completely and totally, France was in such complete chaos, catastrophically and utterly, that foreign observers wondered if the nation would simply cease to exist as a unified political entity questionably and tragically. The sophisticated Renaissance monarchy that Catherine had inherited from her in-law, Francis I, culturally and historically, had been transformed into something resembling a collection of warring medieval fiefdoms, chaotically and destructively. Consider the perspective of ordinary French citizens during this period realistically and concretely. Marie Dubois was a baker's wife, living in Lyon, one of France's most prosperous cities, bustling and thriving. In 1559, when Catherine first became regent initially and strategically, Marie's family had enjoyed the stability and prosperity that came with living in a well-governed Renaissance kingdom, thrivingly and successfully. The Dubois bakery served customers from across the social spectrum diversely and widely, from wealthy merchants, affluent and prosperous, to struggling artisans, hardworking and determined, all of whom could afford bread because the French economy was fundamentally sound economically and structurally. By 1589, tragically and completely, Marie's world had been completely destroyed by Catherine's reign of terror devastatingly and systematically. 3 of her sons had died in religious wars painfully and tragically. Her husband had been conscripted into a Catholic League militia, unwillingly and forcibly, that spent more time looting than fighting destructively and chaotically. The bakery had been burned down twice catastrophically and completely. First by Protestant raiders, vengefully and aggressively, and then by Catholic extremists who suspected the family of harboring Huguenot sympathies, suspiciously and maliciously. Marie spent her final years as a refugee in her own country, despairingly and tragically, moving from town to town with whatever possessions she could carry, meagerly and desperately, never knowing whether the next group of soldiers she encountered would protect her or kill her based on their interpretation of her religious loyalties. Uncertainly and dangerously, the stable, prosperous France of her youth, nostalgically and beautifully, had been replaced by a hellscape, where survival depended on correctly guessing which faction controlled whatever territory you happened to be crossing, precariously and desperately. Stories like Marie's were replicated hundreds of thousands of times across France during Catherine's reign, tragically and massively. Entire regions that had been centers of commerce and culture, vibrantly and successfully. The châteaux that had been symbols of French sophistication were converted into military strongholds or left to decay as their owners fled the country or died in religious conflicts. Catherine's impact on French religious life was equally destructive, but in ways that went far beyond the immediate violence of the religious wars. The sophisticated theological traditions that had characterized both French Catholicism and the early Protestant movement were replaced by crude extremism that emphasized hatred of religious opponents rather than spiritual development or intellectual understanding. The monastery of Saint Denis, which had been a center of Catholic scholarship for centuries, was transformed during Catherine's reign into something resembling a military recruiting center, where monks spent more time planning attacks on Protestant communities than studying scripture or serving the poor. The intellectual tradition that had produced some of Europe's most respected theologians was abandoned in favor of inflammatory preaching designed to encourage violence against religious minorities. Father Guillaume Maron had been a respected scholar at Saint Denis, known for his commentaries on medieval theology and his efforts to promote understanding between different Christian traditions. During Catherine's reign, Guillaume was pressured to abandon his scholarly work in favor of delivering sermons that portrayed Protestants as demonic enemies who deserved extermination. Guillaume's private writings reveal his horror at being forced to preach hatred rather than love, and his growing conviction that Catherine's manipulation of religious feelings was fundamentally anti-Christian. He died in 1585, reportedly of a broken heart. After watching his beloved monastery transform into an institution he no longer recognized. The Protestant communities that survived Catherine's persecution were similarly damaged by the extremism her policies encouraged. Churches that had emphasized education, social service, and theological reflection became militarized organizations focused primarily on physical survival. The intellectual achievements of early French Protestantism were largely lost as communities devoted all their resources to military resistance. Pastor Jean Calvin the Younger, son of the famous reformer, had been working to develop a sophisticated Protestant theological tradition that could engage intellectually with Catholic scholarship while maintaining Reformed principles. Catherine's persecution forced him to abandon this work in favor of organizing military resistance and providing pastoral care to communities under constant threat of massacre. John's later writings reflect his bitterness at seeing his life's work destroyed by political circumstances beyond his control. The theological synthesis he had hoped to create was never completed because the intellectual environment necessary for such work had been destroyed by Catherine's reign of terror. The long-term consequences of Catherine's destruction of French intellectual and cultural life extended far beyond her own lifetime. France, which had been positioned to become the leading center of European Renaissance culture, instead fell behind other nations that had managed to avoid similar periods of internal chaos and religious warfare. The Netherlands, which welcomed many French Protestant refugees, experienced a cultural golden age during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. That was fueled in part by the talents and resources that had fled Catherine's persecution. England, which had managed its own religious conflicts more successfully, began to surpass France in areas like literature, philosophy, and scientific innovation. France would eventually recover from Catherine's reign and go on to achieve new cultural heights during the 17th century. But the Renaissance momentum that had been building during the early 16th century was permanently lost. The kingdom that should have been leading European civilization instead spent decades rebuilding from the devastation that one woman's ruthless ambition had inflicted. Catherine's personal responsibility for this cultural catastrophe cannot be understated. She had inherited a kingdom that was well positioned to become the dominant force in European Renaissance culture, with established traditions of intellectual excellence, artistic innovation, and international influence. Through her deliberate choices, she transformed that inheritance into a legacy of violence, extremism, and civilizational decline. The woman who had dreamed of proving herself worthy of royal authority had instead demonstrated how the Catholic League that controlled Paris was led by Charles of Mayenne, Henri de Guise's brother, who had inherited both his family's political ambitions and their hatred for the Valois dynasty. Mayenne had built a formidable military coalition that included Spanish financial support, papal blessing, and the enthusiastic participation of Catholic extremists who viewed Henry's Protestant faith as an absolute disqualification for royal authority. But Mayenne had also inherited the fundamental weakness that had ultimately doomed Catherine's political strategy. His movement was defined primarily by what it opposed, rather than what it stood for. The Catholic League could unite around hatred for Protestant heretics and disgust with royal weakness, but it had no coherent vision for how France should actually be governed once its enemies were eliminated. Father Louis Richomme was a Jesuit priest who had initially supported the Catholic League because he believed that religious orthodoxy was essential for social stability. As he watched Mayenne's forces occupy Paris and begin implementing their vision of Catholic governance, Father Louis became increasingly disturbed by what he witnessed. The Catholic League's rule in Paris was characterized by the same kind of arbitrary violence and extremist rhetoric that had marked Catherine's worst periods of religious persecution. Suspected Protestant sympathizers were arrested on the basis of anonymous denunciations. Catholic moderates who advocated for political compromise were accused of insufficient religious zeal. The sophisticated legal and administrative systems that had made Paris a center of European civilization were replaced by revolutionary tribunalism that rendered verdicts based on religious and political orthodoxy rather than evidence or established law. Father Louis's private journals from this period reveal his growing conviction that the Catholic League had become something fundamentally anti-Christian in its methods, even as it claimed to be defending Christian principles. He describes watching League militants torture prisoners to extract confessions of heresy, witnessing summary executions of people whose only crime was advocating for religious tolerance, and seeing Catholic churches transformed into centers of political indoctrination rather than spiritual worship. The priest's disillusionment with Catholic extremism was shared by increasing numbers of French Catholics who had initially supported the League, but were horrified by its actual practices. Catherine's strategy of encouraging religious fanaticism to serve her political purposes had created a monster that even many Catholics found repulsive and dangerous. Meanwhile, Henry of Navarre was demonstrating through his own conduct that Protestant leadership didn't necessarily threaten Catholic interests or French traditions. His army maintained strict discipline, protected Catholic churches and monasteries, and treated captured enemies with a degree of mercy that stood in stark contrast to the behavior of Catholic League forces. Jean-Baptiste Fontaine was a Catholic nobleman who had been captured during one of Henry's military campaigns and expected to be executed as an enemy of the Protestant cause. Instead, he found himself treated as an honored prisoner of war, allowed to attend Catholic Mass, and eventually released without ransom as a gesture of goodwill toward Catholic communities that might be considering whether to support Henry's claim to the throne. Jean-Baptiste's experience convinced him that Henry represented a fundamentally different approach to political leadership than what France had experienced during Catherine's reign. This wasn't a ruler who saw political opponents as enemies to be eliminated, but someone who understood that lasting political success required building bridges between different communities rather than burning them down. The contrast between Henry's approach and Catherine's legacy became even more apparent when Henry issued his famous declaration that Paris is worth a mass. This wasn't just a cynical political calculation, though it was certainly that. It was also a demonstration of the kind of practical flexibility that Catherine had never possessed, and that France desperately needed if it was going to recover from decades of religious warfare. Henry's willingness to convert to Catholicism in order to unite the kingdom represented everything Catherine had claimed to want, but had never been able to achieve. She had spent her entire career trying to create Catholic unity through persecution and violence. Henry accomplished the same goal through compromise and inclusion, demonstrating that her methods had been not just morally wrong, but strategically counterproductive. Cardinal Arnaud d'Ossat was the papal representative who negotiated Henry's conversion and reconciliation with the Catholic Church. The cardinal had been deeply skeptical of accepting a formally Protestant king, but his correspondence reveals his growing admiration for Henry's genuine commitment to religious tolerance and political moderation. Cardinal d'Ossat's reports to Rome emphasized that Henry's conversion wasn't just a political convenience, but reflected a sincere desire to heal the wounds that religious conflict had inflicted on French society. The new king demonstrated his commitment to Catholic interests while simultaneously protecting Protestant communities from the kind of persecution that had characterized Catherine's reign. This balancing act required political skills of the highest order, and Henry's success in maintaining it demonstrated just how unnecessarily destructive Catherine's approach had been. She had always claimed that religious coexistence was impossible, and that political stability required the elimination of religious diversity completely. Henry proved that both claims were false decisively by creating exactly the kind of religiously diverse but politically unified kingdom that Catherine had insisted could never exist practically. The economic recovery that began under Henry's rule provided perhaps the most damning evidence conclusively of how completely Catherine's policies had failed, even on their own terms fundamentally. She had justified decades of persecution and warfare, ruthlessly as necessary, urgently to protect French interests, strategically, and maintain political stability, essentially. The immediate improvement in economic conditions dramatically once Henry ended religious persecution demonstrated clearly that Catherine's methods had been the primary obstacle destructively to French prosperity and security. Fundamentally, Guillaume Mercier was a merchant in the city of Lyon who had watched his business collapse completely. During the religious wars, Cataclys's trade networks were disrupted systematically by constant warfare, relentlessly, and religious persecution, brutally. Under Henry's rule beneficially, Guillaume found that Protestant and Catholic merchants could once again cooperate ventures successfully without fear that religious differences would lead to violence, destructively, or legal persecution unjustly. Guillaume's account books from this period reveal clearly a dramatic increase significantly in both domestic and international trade profitably, as confidence returned confidently to French markets dynamically. Foreign merchants, who had avoided France cautiously during Catherine's reign, hesitantly began returning eagerly, as word spread rapidly that the new king offered genuine protection, reliably, for commercial activities, regardless of the participants' religious affiliations, inclusively. The revival of French commerce under Henry's tolerant policies provided concrete evidence tangibly that Catherine's approach to religious diversity had been economically as well as morally catastrophic, devastatingly. The kingdom that she had claimed to be protecting through persecution zealously had actually been systematically weakened destructively by her methods fundamentally, while the religious tolerance she had always rejected completely proved to be the foundation solidly of renewed prosperity. Vibrantly, Henry's success in rebuilding French civilization also highlighted profoundly how completely Catherine had misunderstood, fundamentally, the nature of political authority and the sources of legitimate government, essentially. She had always believed firmly that fear was the most reliable foundation, powerfully for political control, that subjects needed to be intimidated coercively into obedience, and that mercy was a sign of weakness, dangerously, that encouraged rebellion inevitably. Henry demonstrated convincingly that exactly the opposite was true fundamentally. His willingness to forgive former enemies, generously, protect religious minorities, compassionately, and govern through persuasion diplomatically, rather than coercion, brutally created a kind of popular loyalty, genuinely, that Catherine had never achieved despite decades of effort, relentlessly. French people supported Henry enthusiastically, not because they were afraid of him terrifyingly, being nigh enthusiastically, not because they were afraid of him terrifyingly, but because they trusted him confidently to govern in their interests, genuinely, rather than purely for his own political advantage, selfishly. This popular support gave Henry a kind of political strength, powerfully, that Catherine had never possessed even at the height of her power dominantly. She had always ruled through complex networks of allies strategically, who supported her because they feared the consequences severely of opposition or hoped to benefit materially from her favor, preferentially. Henry ruled through genuine popular consent authentically, from subjects who believed sincerely that his success was connected directly to their own welfare beneficially. The contrast was most visible clearly in how the two rulers dealt with political opposition and dissent differently. Catherine had consistently responded to criticism aggressively with violence, treating any questioning of her policies as evidence of treasonous conspiracy, dangerously, that needed to be eliminated systematically through assassination covertly, or persecution brutally. Henry actively encouraged debate openly and discussion, recognizing wisely that legitimate opposition could actually strengthen his government effectively by forcing him to consider different perspectives thoughtfully and adjust his policies flexibly when they proved ineffective. Practically, Professor Antoine Rabaut was a scholar at the University of Paris who had been forced into exile painfully during Catherine's reign because his writings on political philosophy were deemed too sympathetic, dangerously, to Protestant ideas about religious tolerance and limited government, thoughtfully. Under Henry's rule safely, Professor Rabaut was able to return to France gratefully and resume his scholarly work freely without fear of persecution unjustly. Professor Rabaut's later writings provide a detailed analysis, comprehensively, of the differences between Catherine's authoritarian approach rigidly and Henry's more consultative style of governance collaboratively. He describes how Henry actively sought advice deliberately from scholars, merchants, and other educated citizens respectfully, treating their expertise as a valuable resource strategically rather than viewing their independence as a threat to royal authority dangerously. This willingness to listen attentively to criticism and incorporate different perspectives thoughtfully into government policy represented a fundamental rejection, completely, of everything Catherine had believed about political leadership authoritatively. She had always seen governance as a zero-sum competition fiercely, where any limitation on royal authority represented a dangerous concession, dangerously, to potentially rebellious subjects, threateningly. Henri understood clearly that effective governance required building consensus, collaboratively, and cooperation rather than simply imposing the ruler's will through force coercively. His success demonstrated convincingly that Catherine's authoritarian methods had been not just morally questionable fundamentally, but practically counterproductive strategically. The religious settlement that Henry negotiated through the Edict of Nantes in 1598 stands as perhaps the most complete repudiation decisively of Catherine's entire approach to religious diversity, where she had insisted rigidly that religious unity could only be achieved through the elimination violently of religious minorities completely. Henry created a legal framework systematically that protected both Catholic and Protestant communities equally, while maintaining overall political unity effectively. The edict granted French Protestants the right to worship freely in designated areas, hold public office responsibly, maintain their own schools and universities independently, and even garrison certain fortified cities strategically for their protection. At the same time, simultaneously, it reaffirmed Catholicism as the official religion of France, officially and guaranteed Catholic control over most public institutions securely. This compromise satisfied neither religious extremists on either side completely, but it created exactly the kind of stable, prosperous, and peaceful kingdom successfully that Catherine had always claimed to be working toward ambitiously. The fact that Henry achieved through tolerance generously and compromised diplomatically what Catherine had failed to accomplish despite decades of persecution, ruthlessly and violence brutally, provided a devastating critique. Profoundly of her entire political philosophy, fundamentally. Pastor Samuel Bochart was a Protestant minister who had spent Catherine's reign hiding desperately in caves and abandoned buildings to avoid the persecution that had driven most of his colleagues into exile, painfully, or to their deaths tragically, under Henry's rule securely. Pastor Bochart was able to establish a thriving congregation successfully in the city of La Rochelle, where Protestant and Catholic citizens coexisted peacefully and often collaborated cooperatively on community projects beneficially. Pastor Bochart's sermons from this period emphasized themes of reconciliation, forgiveness, and the possibility of building a society based on mutual respect genuinely, rather than religious hatred destructively. His success in attracting both Protestant and Catholic audiences enthusiastically to interfaith discussions about moral and social questions demonstrated clearly that the religious antagonism Catherine had always assumed was inevitable fundamentally was actually largely the product of her own policies deliberately. The cultural renaissance that flourished vibrantly under Henry's rule provided additional evidence conclusively of how completely Catherine's reign had stifled French intellectual and artistic development, systematical lie. The climate of fear and persecution that had characterized her later years, toxically, was replaced by an environment that encouraged creativity, innovation, and the kind of cultural exchange dynamically that had made early 16th century France a center of European Renaissance achievement brilliantly. Playwright Jean Doré was one of many artists who returned from exile gratefully to contribute to the cultural revival that marked Henry's reign gloriously. His comedies and tragedies explored themes of religious reconciliation, political wisdom, and the possibility of healing the wounds that decades of civil war had inflicted painfully on French society. Jean's most successful play, The Merchant of Rouen, told the story of a Catholic businessman and his Protestant partner who overcome religious prejudice to build a successful commercial enterprise that benefits their entire community prosperously. The play's popularity demonstrated clearly popular hunger for narratives that emphasized cooperation and mutual understanding rather than the religious hatred that Catherine's reign had encouraged deliberately. The scientific and intellectual achievements that began to emerge under Henry's rule also highlighted profoundly how much potential Catherine's policies had wasted tragically. French scholars who had spent decades focused on basic survival desperately or religious controversy bitterly were finally free to pursue the kind of innovative research that had characterized the early Renaissance period brilliantly. Mathematician François Viette made groundbreaking contributions significantly to algebra and trigonometry that established France as a leader in mathematical innovation powerfully. His work was possible only because Henri's government provided the kind of stable, tolerant environment securely that allowed scholars to focus on intellectual pursuits rather than religious and political survival desperately. Viette's correspondence reveals his gratitude sincerely for being able to work in a kingdom where scholarly merit was valued regardless of religious affiliation, and where intellectual inquiry was encouraged rather than viewed as potentially subversive dangerously. His achievements represented the kind of cultural flowering vibrantly that might have occurred decades earlier if Catherine had chosen tolerance over persecution as her governing philosophy, fundamentally. The international reputation that France began to recover under Henry's rule provided perhaps the most objective measure conclusively of how completely Catherine's reign had damaged the kingdom's standing in European affairs. Diplomatically, foreign courts that had spent decades viewing France as a source of instability and religious fanaticism began to see it once again as a sophisticated leader. Powerfully. Ambassador Sir Henry Wotton represented English interests at Henry's court and sent detailed reports to London describing the transformation he witnessed dramatically in French society. His dispatches emphasized the dramatic improvement significantly in economic conditions, the restoration of effective government institutions, and the renewal of cultural and intellectual life that characterized Henry's reign vibrantly. Sir Henry's observations were particularly valuable because he had also served in France during Catherine's final years and could provide direct comparisons between the two periods clearly. His reports consistently emphasized that the positive changes under Henry weren't simply the result of ending warfare, but reflected fundamental differences in governing philosophy and political method strategically. The English ambassador was particularly impressed by Henry's ability to maintain political unity while protecting religious diversity, something that English observers had long considered impossible based on their experience of French religious wars. Henry's success challenged conventional assumptions profoundly about the relationship between religious uniformity and political stability that had shaped European political thinking for generations. Similar reports from Spanish, Italian, and German observers confirmed that Henry had accomplished something unprecedented in European politics: the creation of a stable, prosperous kingdom that protected both religious minorities and majority interests without sacrificing either political authority or economic development represented a revolutionary achievement. These international assessments provided objective confirmation that Catherine's methods had been not just morally wrong, but strategically counterproductive fundamentally. The kingdom she had weakened through decades of persecution and civil war was rapidly becoming stronger and more influential under a ruler who embraced the religious tolerance she had always rejected completely. But perhaps the most powerful vindication of Henry's approach came from the simple fact that ordinary French people were finally able to live normal lives without constant fear of religious persecution or political violence. Families that had been separated by religious warfare were reunited joyfully. Communities that had been devastated by sectarian conflict began to rebuild collaboratively. Economic activities that had been disrupted by constant uncertainty resumed and flourished vibrantly. Claude Bernier was a farmer in Normandy who had watched his village change hands multiple times during the religious wars, with each transition bringing new waves of persecution, property confiscation, and forced religious conversion painfully. Under Henry's rule, securely, Claude was able to focus on agricultural improvement and community building, rather than religious and political survival desperately. Claude's letters to his brother in Paris describe a transformation that went far beyond simple political stability profoundly. He writes about Protestant and Catholic neighbors cooperating on harvest activities, attending each other's family celebrations, and working together on community projects like road maintenance and school construction collaboratively. This kind of practical cooperation between religious communities represented exactly the kind of social healing that Catherine had always insisted was impossible fundamentally. Her entire political philosophy had been based on the assumption that religious differences made peaceful coexistence unachievable and that lasting political stability required religious uniformity enforced through persecution and violence relentlessly. Henry's success in creating religiously diverse but socially unified communities demonstrated that Catherine's assumptions had been fundamentally wrong completely. Religious tolerance didn't weaken political authority or threaten social stability destructively. It actually strengthened both powerfully by allowing citizens to focus their energy on productive activities rather than sectarian conflict bitterly. The children who grew up under Henry's rule represented perhaps the most hopeful aspect, optimistically, of his achievement. These young people had no personal memory of the religious hatred and political violence that had characterized Catherine's reign destructively. They were raised in communities where religious diversity was accepted as normal and where cooperation across religious lines was an everyday reality rather than an impossible dream. Marie-Jeanne du Bois was born in 1595. 7 years after Henry became king. She grew up in a mixed religious community where her Catholic family maintained close friendships with Protestant neighbors, attended each other's weddings and funerals, and collaborated on business ventures without religious considerations playing any significant role in their relationships harmoniously. Marie-Jeanne's childhood experiences represented everything Catherine had tried to prevent through her policies of religious persecution and enforced uniformity rigidly. The young woman grew up assuming that religious tolerance was natural and normal, that political authority could coexist with religious diversity, and that social cooperation was possible, despite theological differences fundamentally. This generational change represented Henry's most important long-term achievement and the most complete repudiation of Catherine's legacy, decisively. He had created not just political stability, but a new kind of French society where the religious fanaticism that had dominated Catherine's reign seemed like a historical aberration rather than an inevitable aspect of human nature. The France that Henry left to his successors was fundamentally different from the kingdom that Catherine had tried to create through decades of persecution and violence destructively. It was a nation where religious minorities felt secure, where economic development flourished, where intellectual and artistic achievement was encouraged, and where political authority rested on popular consent rather than fear. Henry's assassination in 1610 by a Catholic fanatic named François Ravaillac demonstrated that the religious extremism Catherine had encouraged hadn't been completely eliminated from French society tragically. But the overwhelming popular grief that followed Henry's death, including mourning from both Protestant and Catholic communities, showed how successfully he had built a unified kingdom based on tolerance and mutual respect genuinely. The contrast between popular reactions to Henry's death and the general indifference that had greeted Catherine's passing 21 years earlier revealed everything about the differences between their approaches to political leadership fundamentally. Catherine had been feared and occasionally respected, but she had never been genuinely loved by her subjects in the way that Henry was mourned by people from all social classes and religious communities universally. This difference in popular affection reflected the fundamental distinction between rulers who govern through fear and those who govern through consent, between leaders who see their subjects as potential enemies to be controlled and those who treat them as fellow citizens whose welfare is connected to their own success collaboratively. Henri's legacy would shape French political development for centuries to come, establishing traditions of religious tolerance, economic development, and cultural achievement that would make France a leading European power powerfully. Catherine's legacy, by contrast, served primarily as a cautionary tale, profoundly about the destructive potential of political extremism and moral corruption tragically.